Hi, my name is Bianca. I'm 34 years old and I'm sitting in my apartment, the very same one I bought 3 years ago, taking out a mortgage and writing in my heart the feeling that from now on, every decision I make will be measured not only by my desires, but also by my payment schedule. This evening, I'm looking at a letter from our company's HR department, and in it, in a delicately emotionless tone, I'm offered a 2-year job at the European branch. The words, 2 years, echo in my head, because that's a period of time during which so much changes, and even those little comforts that keep me clinging tightly to my home suddenly seem like an expense I have no right to if I'm going to maintain financial stability. I work at a large tech company and hold a fairly respectable position there. The money is good, though, and thanks to that, I was able to get this apartment. Not luxurious, but mine. And now, thinking about how the bank will withdraw its share every month, regardless of my presence, I realize that leaving it empty for 2 years is pure extravagance. So the idea of renting it out became not just a plan, but a necessity. And I decided to make sure the rent would cover the mortgage payments and not leave me empty-handed. I called my lawyer friend Leopoldo. He was helping me with the paperwork for the purchase. And when he answered, I immediately said, "Leopoldo, I need to ask you something." I explained the situation and added that I was afraid of tax traps. He sighed and smiled slightly, saying that the most important thing is a proper lease agreement and an accurate income tax return, and that if you keep receipts and keep track of your expenses, there won't be any problems. His calm eased some of my anxiety, but added a practical reality to the emotions I was still trying to organize. Then came the renovations. The apartment looked fine, but the kitchen needed a new paint job, the bathroom needed new tiles, and the living room walls needed some scuffing. Nothing outrageous, but all of this needed to be done so the apartment would look well maintained and wouldn't turn people off. On a friend's recommendation, I found a team that arrived the following Monday. 3 guys led by Tony, who glanced around the room and, asking pointedly, "What do we see here?" Made a list. Paint the kitchen, replace the tiles in the bathroom, and fix the scuffing on the living room walls. He confidently said they'd be done in 2 weeks tops, but sternly added, "You can't stay here while we're working. Too much dust and noise." And this decision forced me to look for temporary shelter. I called my old friend Sarah, who has a big house on the other side of town and always has a spare room, and asked, almost sheepishly, "Sarah, can I stay with you for a couple of weeks? I'm finishing up some renovations." "Sure," she replied, and I packed several bags, feeling a little guilty for intruding on her routine, and moved into the guest room. The next day, contractors were already hammering and drilling, and as I drove past Sarah's house, I heard through the noise the thought of how good it was to be temporarily out of the center of all that noise. But there was one thing I put off the longest, coming out to my parents because we were fine, but they were the kind of people who love to be involved in everything, offering their favorite formulaic advice, and when your loved ones make such an intrusive, helping gesture, it becomes a heavy burden. My sister, Alda, is 8 years younger than me. She's 26, and she still lives with her parents, which doesn't surprise me because they've always looked after her. She's been dating a guy named David for about 6 months now. He's a nice guy, but from what I've seen, he doesn't work much. Alda herself, for that matter, isn't exactly striving for independence, even though she went to college with my help because my parents couldn't afford it back then. Finally, 2 weeks before leaving, I plucked up the courage to call my mom. I asked her to invite me over for dinner because I needed to share the news. Mom, as usual, happily agreed and added that she would cook my favorite stew, saying that Alda and David would also be home. I arrived promptly at 6 with a bottle of wine, because news inevitably becomes easier to bear when there is a familiar ritual at the table, and my parents' house, bought by them back in my school years, still seems bigger and more secure to me than mine. And we sat down to dinner. My mother laid out on the table the very dish that always warmed me, and Alda kept looking at her phone, which, alas, has become typical behavior of the younger generation. Then my mother, putting down her spoon, quietly asked, "What news did you want to share?" And I took a deep breath and said, keeping a tremor in my voice, "The company offered me a position in Europe. I will not be there for 2 years. I will be working in our branch." My parents exchanged glances and then, almost simultaneously, looked back at me, and in their eyes I immediately read the familiar curiosity mixed with concern. Mom, leaning forward slightly, quietly said, "Tell us more." And I, exhaling, began to explain everything I hadn't yet fully grasped. The nature of the position, the responsibilities I'd be fulfilling, the length of my leave, and the prospects that lay before me. But, catching my sister Alda rolling her eyes out of the corner of my eye, I felt the familiar splinter of irritation pierce my heart again, because she always did that when I talked about work, as if it were boring and unworthy of attention. Dad, on the other hand, nodded and said, "That sounds wonderful, dear. We're proud of you." And his words warmed me for a moment, but I knew it was only the beginning of the conversation, so I added, "Thank you. But there's one more thing. I plan to rent out my apartment while I'm gone, because I can't leave it empty for 2 years, and the mortgage payments are still coming." And at that moment, the mood in the room changed instantly, as if someone had turned off the lights. Mom and Dad looked at each other again, and I immediately recognized this silent dialogue they'd exchanged their entire lives. And then Mom slowly said, "You don't need to rent it out to strangers. Alda and David could stay there, and you'll know the apartment is in good hands and you won't have to worry about tenants damaging the property." I blinked and asked, "Excuse me?" But Mom continued, saying that my sister needed her own space, that David had been talking about his own place for a long time, and that they were planning to get married. At that moment, I noticed that Alda suddenly perked up and stopped staring at her phone, and David was smiling as broadly as if he'd won the jackpot. "Okay," I said cautiously. "If they want to rent the apartment from me, I'm open to it. I'd even give you a 20% discount on the price I was planning on." At that moment, the room fell silent. Mom turned pale and almost hissed, "Are you serious? Are you really going to take money from your sister?" I stared at her and said firmly, "Mom, I have a mortgage. The whole point of renting out the apartment is to cover the payments while I'm gone." But she kept repeating louder and louder, "But she's family." And finally Alda intervened. "Oh my God, Bianca, you're so greedy. I can't believe you won't just let me live there. I'm helping the family." "Helping?" I couldn't resist. "Who paid for your college education when you said you couldn't afford it? Who lent you the money when you asked?" Dad cleared his throat and interjected, "That's completely different, dear." But I flushed. "How is that different?" Alda leaned forward and said defiantly, "Because you earn so much more than us, you can let me live there for free." I felt the blood rush to my face and my blood pressure rise. "Alda, I earn more because I work tirelessly, and I have bills too. I need that income." Dad chimed in, "We're saving for Alda's wedding," and I looked straight at him and asked, "And I need the income to pay the mortgage. How is my situation different from yours?" Alda slammed her hand on the table and blurted out, "Because we're your family, that's why. And besides, I don't want to live in my parents' rented apartment. The neighborhood there is terrible, and yours is downtown, close to everything." "So you want a better apartment, but you don't want to pay for it?" I was almost screaming. "God, you're such a jerk," Alda hissed. And then David finally spoke up, trying to smooth things over. "Come on, Bianca, we wouldn't have trashed it. We'd have taken good care of it." I looked at him and said, "I'm sure you would have, but I'm not a charity case." There was a complete silence. A pin drop could have been heard, and Mom, with an icy expression, said, "I think you should leave." "That's fine with me," I replied, grabbed my purse, and headed for the door. No one said goodbye. No one walked me out. I just left. The drive back to Sarah's house was a blur, and I was shaking with anger, my insides seething with the thought, how dare they act like I owed them something, like wanting to collect rent on my own apartment was unreasonable. When I walked in, Sarah was in the kitchen and, smiling, asked, "Hey, how was dinner?" But when she looked at my face, she immediately paled. "Oh shit, what happened?" And barely holding back tears, I told her everything, every word of that terrible conversation. Sarah shook her head and said quietly, "Bianca, darling, I hate to say this, but they always favored Alda. Even in high school, she got away with everything, while you were always expected to be responsible and helpful. I sat down at the kitchen table, put my head in my hands, and whispered, "You're right. I know you're right, but it still hurts." Sarah set a cup of tea in front of me and one for herself, and we sat and talked until almost midnight, her words gradually turning my anger into a quiet, bitter weariness. She reminded me of all the times over the years when my parents had shamelessly asked me for money, when I had paid for repairs to my father's car or for my mother's medicine, when I had helped cover Alda's tuition or simply become the family ATM for everyone who had no right to refuse, and I listened to Sarah, nodding because every phrase she said struck home. And then I heard her firmly, "You're doing the right thing, Bianca. Don't let them make you change your mind." And I decided in that moment, no, I won't allow it. But God, how terrible it is to feel like a stranger among those closest to you. The next 3 days passed surprisingly quietly. No calls from my parents, no short messages from Alda, no attempt to start a conversation, nothing. And in this silence, I caught myself feeling strange. On the one hand, I could breathe easier, but on the other, my chest ached because they weren't even trying to understand my situation, as if I were a stranger to them. On the 4th day, I finally went to my apartment to check on the progress of the renovation, and upon opening the door, I froze in delight. The work was finished, and my home sparkled with cleanliness and freshness. Fresh paint on the walls filled the air with a new scent. The bathroom sparkled with new fixtures. The kitchen gleamed with updated hardware, and I couldn't help but admit that Tony and his crew had done a magnificent job. After they left, I was left alone in my quiet, updated apartment and opened my laptop to browse the rental applications that had come in online. Although there were quite a few, one couple immediately stood out. Nestor and Beatrice, both with good jobs, impeccable credit, and excellent references from previous landlords. They seemed simply perfect, and I decided not to delay. That same day, I dialed the number, and hearing a female voice on the line said, "Hello, is this Beatrice? This is Bianca, asking about renting an apartment. Would you like to see it? I can meet you this afternoon." She replied in a calm, pleasant voice. "The day after tomorrow, around 2 o'clock, that would be ideal. We're very interested." I smiled. "Wonderful. I'll send you the address." 2 days later, I arrived at the building a little early and waited outside, looking at the entrance. At exactly 2 o'clock, they appeared. A pleasant couple in their early 30s, dressed in business attire, neat and tasteful, and their confidence immediately endeared them to me. We took the elevator to the 3rd floor together, and while we were riding, I chatted with them about the neighborhood, telling them about the grocery store around the corner where the bread was always fresh, and about the restaurant 2 blocks away that served amazing ravioli. Nestor smiled. "Sounds like a great neighborhood." And I replied, "It really is. I really like living here." We approached the door, I pulled out the key, and opening the lock, I said, "Well, here we are," pushed the door open, and walked in first, followed by them. At that moment, my breath literally caught in my throat, because I saw something I hadn't expected. Alda was sitting on my couch in sweatpants and a stretched-out t-shirt, and David was standing in the kitchen making himself a sandwich, suitcases piled up by the window, and her clothes were casually thrown on a chair, and it felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. "What the hell?" escaped my lips, and Beatrice and Nestor, behind me, froze in the doorway, confused and clearly shaken by the scene. Alda looked up from the couch as if nothing unusual had happened and calmly said, "Oh, hi, Bianca, you should have knocked." To which I coldly replied, "Knock? This is my apartment." But David, unfazed, turned from the kitchen counter, sandwich in hand, and threw a soft, "Hey," to Nestor and Beatrice, as if it were the most natural thing to do. I noticed Nestor and Beatrice exchange glances, and then Beatrice quietly said, "Is now a bad time?" "No, it's not a good time," I snapped, feeling my voice grow louder. "Those people don't belong here," I added, but Alda suddenly stood up and declared, "Actually, we do." Mom gave us a key yesterday. We'll live here while you're gone." I stared at her, disbelieving. "What? The spare key I left with Mom when I bought the apartment? She gave it to us yesterday. We moved in last night," my sister replied calmly. My hands were shaking, and I felt Beatrice gently touch my palm and suggest, "Maybe we should come back another time." But I could already tell from her eyes that her decision had been made, and this introduction was over. "No, wait." I tried to hold them back, but Nestor had already said, "We'll call you," and I knew they wouldn't, and I heard their footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving me alone with my sister and her smug boyfriend. I turned to them, and they looked at me as if I was the one being unreasonable, and I said coldly, "Go away." "We're not going anywhere," Alda replied. "Mom said we can stay here," David added, even nodding as if to conclude, and then said quite calmly, "Yes, and don't worry about the utilities or anything else. We decided you could continue paying for them yourself." I took out my phone, my hands still shaking with rage, and feeling their gazes burning into me from across the room, I dialed my mother's number. She answered on the third ring, and without even saying hello, I asked, "Did you really give Alda the key to my apartment?" Her voice took on that familiar defensive tone that always gave her away when she knew she was wrong, but didn't want to admit it. "Alda needs a place to live, and you're being selfish. I thought if they just moved, you'd realize how stupid you were being." I couldn't believe my ears. My mother's words sounded as if she was justifying a clear violation of my boundaries and turning into a trivial matter what for me was an invasion and betrayal. "Mom, this is breaking and entering. They have no right to be in my apartment," I said, trying to find a tone that would not turn into hysteria. But she responded indifferently, "Don't be dramatic. They are family members." And in her voice, I could hear the same ready-made defense that I knew from years when any of my complaints were curtailed in conversations about family support. I told her about Nestor and Beatrice, how they'd gotten embarrassed and left the moment they saw the pile of suitcases and my half-naked sister on my couch, how awkward they'd been, and instead of understanding, my mother had once again insisted that I was overreacting and that I needed to stop being so materialistic. And I, feeling a pang of helplessness clench inside, finally hung up because I couldn't bear to listen to the excuses of those who seemed oblivious to their own guilt. Alda laughed, and her laughter was like another sting. "You should have seen your face when you walked in here," she said, turning to David. And in their gaze there was that easy, smug superiority that always hurt me more than direct words, because it said, "We have the right, and you don't." And I left the apartment without wasting unnecessary words on goodbyes, because I didn't want to make a scene, got into the car in the parking lot, and despite my shaking hands and pounding heart, dialed 911, because otherwise it would have been just a concession. "I need to report an unauthorized entry," I told the dispatcher calmly and clearly, explaining the address, that there were people in my apartment without my permission, and that I would meet patrol in the lobby. 20 minutes later, 2 officers, Martinez and Kim, were standing in front of me, calm and deliberate in their movements, and as we rode up the elevator together, I recounted the whole story. My upcoming deployment to Europe, my plans to rent out the apartment, my family's attitude, and, most importantly, that the spare key had been handed over without my knowledge. Officer Martinez asked for their identification, and I watched Alda and David's faces change from confident to worried as the officer checked their licenses. Then he turned to me and asked formally, "Ma'am, do you confirm that you did not authorize these people to be in the apartment?" "I do," I replied. Officer Kim politely but firmly asked Alda and David for some proof of their rights, a lease, a written consent from the owner, but they had nothing but explanations about Mom's key. And then Officer Martinez said calmly and professionally, "You need to pack your things and leave the premises within an hour." And at that moment, as if the lid had blown off, Alda launched into a verbal storm filled with accusations and insults directed at me. She screamed, called me vile names, said I was ruining her life, and that I always envied her. And then, When her emotions completely took over, she tried to attack me. Officer Kim instantly grabbed her arm to prevent her from attacking, and then David, in a fit of defensiveness, pushed the officer away, which turned out to be a fatal mistake. Both officers physically restrained him, and in a matter of seconds, David was on the floor in handcuffs. Alda, seeing this, only increased her screaming and, trying to kick Officer Martinez, received the same response. She, too, was put in steel bracelets, and I stood there in disbelief as they were read their rights and the charges announced, unauthorized entry and assault on an officer. They were led out of my apartment to loud screams and cries that echoed down the hallway. When the door slammed shut, a strange silence fell over the apartment, and for several minutes I simply sat on the couch, breathing deeply, feeling every muscle slowly return to its proper rhythm, my gaze gliding over the traces of their presence: scattered clothes, open suitcases, a half-cooked sandwich on the kitchen counter, as if a strange, deeply flawed life had suddenly abandoned its mess and departed without bothering to clean up after itself. The next 2 hours passed in silent labor. I put their things back into the suitcases without unnecessary ceremony, not allowing myself sadness or the right to triumph, simply packing and zipping, because I didn't want the memory of this to remain in my house. Then I ordered a courier service to pick up the bags and deliver them to my parents. I didn't want to deal with the humiliating delivery myself, and while I waited for the courier, I dialed the number of the locksmith the building manager had recommended because I knew the locks needed to be changed immediately to prevent anyone else from getting in without my knowledge. Standing in the hallway, clutching the phone, I said into the receiver, "Hi, this is Bianca from apartment 3B. I need the locks changed today, right now, if possible." He said he could be there in an hour, and true to his word, he showed up exactly when he promised, with a neat toolbox and the familiar, confident smile of a handyman who knows the value of his work. 30 minutes of the ringing clank of metal, the smell of grease, and the quiet grinding sound, and my door already had brand new locks, meaning the old spare key my parents had completely lost all meaning, and only I now had to decide who to trust with access to my space and when. The entire time it was working, my phone never stopped ringing. The calls followed one after another, familiar numbers flashing over and over again, but I didn't answer because I knew I was too vulnerable now and any word could sound weak. When the calls dried up, the messages poured in. Mom wrote long tirades describing me as a terrible daughter, a selfish person, a family destroyer, and a monster who had led poor Alda away in handcuffs. I stared at the screen, where the words flashed one after another, but I didn't answer a single one. I left them hanging like empty bubbles that no longer had any power over me. The next morning, Officer Martinez called, his voice calm and businesslike, informing me that my sister and her boyfriend had spent the night in jail and were asking if I was going to press charges. I considered it, letting the thought linger. Part of me wanted it, wanted closure. But another, more tired part of me understood. They were still a family, even if they were acting like irresponsible children. "No, I don't want to press charges for trespassing," I said firmly, but added that David's behavior toward the officer was no longer my responsibility. "He'll probably get a fine and community service, maybe anger management classes," Martinez said, and I responded with a short, "Not my problem," feeling like I truly meant it for the first time in a long time. But I still had a pressing concern. I knew time was running out, just a week before leaving for Europe, and the place was empty, and I'd already lost ideal tenants to that nightmare. So I called Danny, a longtime friend and experienced real estate agent. "Danny, I need help," I said. "I'm leaving in a week and the apartment needs to be rented." His response was the relief I'd been waiting for. "Sure, send me photos, I'll list it, arrange showings and negotiations, and you focus on preparing for the trip." And I spent the rest of the day with my phone and camera, photographing every room, every detail, the gleam of the new fixtures, the clean lines of the freshly painted walls, the coziness of the kitchen with its updated cabinetry, and sent it all to Danny, along with the lease terms. 3 days later, I was already on a plane flying to Europe, and 2 weeks later, Danny called. He'd found wonderful tenants, a young doctor couple who signed the lease on the spot, and I breathed a sigh of relief as if an invisible weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The work was stressful but exciting. The city was dazzlingly beautiful. The monthly rent was coming in regularly and fully covering the mortgage. And I felt like I'd finally built my life on a solid foundation, where other people's wishes no longer dictated my actions. For the first month in Europe, my phone was blissfully silent. No calls from my parents, no angry messages from Alda, as if they'd erased me from their daily lives, and frankly, I was only too glad about that. And then Aunt Carol called, my father's sister, always the most reasonable in our family. "Bianca, dear, how are you doing?" She began, then added softly, "I wanted to tell you about Alda's wedding." And then her words revealed a part of the picture I hadn't known. David's parents had learned about what had happened in my apartment, about his arrest, about the police, and as Carol had said, they were absolutely horrified. They called my parents and told them point blank that they found it disgusting, that Alda was spoiled and complacent, and that they would not encourage such behavior. Moreover, David's parents were supposed to pay for most of the wedding expenses. They had already paid a deposit for the venue and the catering, but after what had happened, they broke off all their obligations and said that if the couple wanted the wedding, they should pay for it themselves. I listened, and everything inside me was a mixture of surprise and a strange sense of justice. Carol continued, "Alda went to your mother, begged her to let them live in the apartment that belonged to her parents, but your mother said no." I couldn't help but laugh, because suddenly it seemed Mom, too, understood what rent meant. "Exactly," Carol confirmed. "Alda threw a terrible tantrum, screaming that it wasn't fair, that her parents were just as greedy as you, and your mother didn't like that at all. They had a huge fight and Alda stormed out of the house. Now she and David were huddled in a tiny studio apartment, the walls so thin you could probably hear every movement of the neighbors. And, as Carol said, they had almost completely stopped communicating with my parents because the whole family was effectively locked in a state of Cold War, where every day brought new grievances and mutual accusations. Alda kept telling everyone that I was the one who ruined her wedding plans. My parents insisted that I was the cause of all this drama from the start. And in the end, everyone was angry at everyone else. But the main target of their anger was still me. "Your mother always says it's all your fault," Carol said softly. "Last week, she even admitted to me that if you'd been a better sister, none of this would have happened." I couldn't help but exclaim, "Better sister? Are you kidding?" Because my mother's words sounded ridiculous and unfair. "You've been more than generous to this family all these years," Carol continued firmly, "and the way they treated you was shameful." And in that moment, I felt how important it was to finally hear someone admit that I wasn't crazy and that my perspective wasn't alone. Carol had always been the voice of reason. I cautiously asked, "How are they doing financially?" And Carol sighed, explaining that things were going badly. David was scraping by with odd jobs but hadn't found anything stable, and Alda had gotten a job at a retail store, which she clearly didn't enjoy, and all her time was spent not working but complaining about how unfair it was that she had to work when, in her opinion, she should be solely focused on wedding planning. I asked if she had tried looking for a real, full-time job to ease their situation a little, but Carol only smiled bitterly. You know, Alda never had much motivation for that. 3 months passed, and Carol called again with news. She told me that David's parents had tried to reconcile, but only on the condition that he apologized to me and try to make amends for everything he'd done. But David flatly refused, insisting he'd done nothing wrong and that I'd overreacted by calling the police. "Unbelievable," I whispered into the phone, feeling a wave of indignation rising inside me again. In response, Carol explained that his parents were adamant. Until he took responsibility for his actions, they wanted nothing to do with him, and thus David had lost even their support. The situation was becoming increasingly difficult. The relationship between Alda and David was beginning to crumble like a house of cards in a draft, and the constant stress of lack of money, cut-off support, and unfulfilled wedding plans was having a devastating effect on them, leading to endless arguments. "Alda even called your mother last week in tears," Carol said, "begging her to talk to you and convince you to help them somehow." I paused, holding my breath, and asked, "And what did Mom say?" Carol answered without hesitation. "She said she wouldn't call you because you'd made it clear you didn't care about your family." To this, I laughed with relief. Good, because I wouldn't have answered anyway. By then, 6 months had passed since my European assignment, and I felt like a thriving woman, finally freed from the cycle of other people's expectations and demands. The apartment in my hometown continued to provide a steady rental income. The mortgage was paid on time, and thanks to a good salary abroad, I even had time to save a decent amount. My work was truly interesting, full of challenges and discoveries, and I made wonderful friends among my colleagues from different countries, who became almost like a second family to me. I went months without hearing from my parents or Alda, and that's exactly what I wanted. A quiet moment free from the endless pressure. Carol, of course, continued to call every few weeks just to check in and occasionally gave me news about my family, even though I'd long since stopped asking about it. I no longer cared what was happening to Alda and David. They had made their choice, and now they had to live with its consequences. One day, in one of our conversations, Carol said, "I'm proud of you for standing your ground. Your parents always expected you to be that responsible person who solves other people's problems, but it's time to finally say no to someone." I just sighed and replied, "I'm just tired of being taken advantage of." "As you should," she remarked. "You worked hard for what you have. No one has the right to just take it away from you, family or otherwise." And now, sitting that evening by the large window of my European apartment, looking out at the twinkling lights of the city, I felt only peace and no guilt. I had made the right choice. My apartment was in caring hands, my bills were paid on time, I was living by my own rules, and for the first time, I felt that this was true freedom. Sometimes family isn't just blood, but people who truly respect and support you. And sometimes the smartest thing to do is leave those who see you only as a source of money and favors.